Hey guys, this is David Payton from New York. Welcome to Boring History Documentary. Tonight, we are stepping into one of those historical subjects that sounds simple at first, and then slowly becomes much more interesting the closer we look at it. Medieval people are often described as dirty, careless, and strangely indifferent to bathing. But that familiar picture is too neat and in some ways too modern. The real story is not just about whether people washed. It is about water, labor, religion, climate, medicine, privacy, status, and the practical limits of everyday life. And once we begin to see those things together, the question changes. It is no longer just why medieval people rarely bathed. It becomes what bathing meant, what it cost, and what people believed they were protecting when they avoided it. If you enjoy calm, thoughtful history told with a little more depth and a little less noise, consider subscribing. This channel is built for long evenings, quiet curiosity, and the kind of stories that become more revealing the longer you stay with them. And if you'd like to support this video, a simple like really does help more people find long-form history that takes its time. As always, feel free to leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, what time it is where you are, and what history topic you'd like us to explore in a future documentary. To begin, we should clear away one misunderstanding. Medieval people did not wake up one day and collectively decide that bathing was unimportant. Many of them lived in a world where washing was familiar, useful, and sometimes even pleasurable. In fact, in the earlier medieval centuries, especially in places shaped by Roman habits or by Islamic influence, bathing could still be part of ordinary life. Public bathhouses existed in some towns. Steam bathing survived in parts of Northern and Eastern Europe. Monasteries had washing routines. Noble households valued clean linen, combed hair, rinsed hands, and well-kept appearances. So the first twist in this story is that medieval people were not ignorant of cleanliness. They simply understood it differently, and they pursued it through methods that do not always look like modern bathing. That difference matters. When modern viewers think of cleanliness, they usually picture a full-body bath or shower, hot water on demand, soap within easy reach, and a private room designed for the purpose. Very few medieval people had anything like that. A proper bath required a great deal of work. Water had to be drawn from a river, well, spring, or cistern. It had to be carried, often by hand. If it was to be warmed, fuel had to be gathered, bought, chopped, and burned. Tub had to be filled. A room had to be prepared. Then, after the bath, all of it had to be emptied and cleaned. Even for well-off households, this was not a trivial routine. For ordinary people, especially those working long hours in fields, workshops, or kitchens, a full bath was less a habit than an event. And this is where the subject becomes more layered than the old stereotype suggests. Medieval life was not organized around convenience. It was organized around survival, season, rank, and necessity. A peasant family might spend an enormous portion of its energy simply securing enough food, tending animals, preserving fuel, repairing tools, mending clothing, and meeting obligations to landlords or local authorities. In that setting, a full immersion bath was not always the obvious use of labor or resources. Washing the hands, face, neck, and visible parts of the body could make far more practical sense. So could changing or airing linen. So could rubbing the skin, combing the hair, or using scented herbs. These were not random substitutes. They were part of a different system of bodily care. Clean linen, in particular, was extremely important. This is one of those small details that quietly changes the whole picture. Medieval and early modern people often believed that linen worn close to the skin helped draw sweat and impurities away from the body. Shirts and shifts could be changed, beaten, aired, washed, and dried more easily than heating enough water for repeated full-body bathing. So when people tried to stay clean, they did not always focus first on soaking the body. They focused on what touched it. A fresh linen undergarment could be understood not just as respectable, but as healthful. In a world without modern plumbing, that idea had its own logic. Hair care offers another useful clue. Medieval grooming was often far more attentive than modern stereotypes allow. Combs were common personal items. Hair could be cleaned, deloused, and maintained with care, even when full bathing was infrequent. Head coverings also helped protect hair from dust and weather. For women especially, covered hair was often tied not only to modesty, but to order and maintenance. Men too might trim beards, wash their faces, rinse their hands before meals, and present themselves according to the expectations of rank and place. In other words, the absence of frequent bathing did not mean the absence of grooming. It meant that grooming followed a different rhythm. We also need to understand the medical thinking of the time, because it shaped behavior more than many people realize. Medieval medicine drew heavily on ancient authorities, especially Galen and related humoral traditions. The body was believed to be governed by balances of heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. In that framework, opening the pores through heat and water could be helpful in some situations but risky in others. A hot bath might relax the body, yes, but it might also leave a person vulnerable. If the pores were open too much, harmful air or corrupt influences might enter. Bathing at the wrong time, in the wrong condition, or with the wrong degree of heat could be considered dangerous. This was not mere superstition in the casual sense. It was part of a coherent medical worldview that tried to explain illness through the movement and balance of bodily substances. That medical concern became even more significant during and after times of epidemic disease. When plague and recurrent outbreaks of illness moved through Europe, anxieties about the body became more intense. Public bathhouses, once valued in some communities, could come to seem suspicious. Crowded indoor spaces, shared heat, shared water, shared benches, shared cloths, and unfamiliar bodies all carried a different emotional charge when disease was feared. Some authorities worried that bathing weakened the body. Others feared that communal bathhouses encouraged immorality as much as illness. And here we arrive at another important reversal. Bathhouses did not simply vanish because people became less civilized. In some places, they declined because changing moral and medical ideas made them seem less safe and less respectable. That moral dimension is easy to overlook if we think only in terms of hygiene. Medieval bathhouses, especially in towns, could be social places. Depending on the period and location, they might include eating, drinking, conversation, treatment for aches, and in some cases sexual commerce or at least the suspicion of it. This meant that attitudes toward bathing were often tangled up with attitudes toward discipline and public behavior. Churchmen, civic authorities, and moral reformers did not always object to washing itself. They objected to what they believed certain bathing spaces had become. A place once associated with health and sociability could, over time, acquire a reputation for temptation, idleness, or disorder. Once that happened, discouraging bathing in those settings became part of a wider effort to regulate urban life. Climate and geography mattered too. A winter bath in a stone house or timber dwelling, with drafts moving through walls and smoke hanging in the air, was not the same experience as a warm bath in a modern heated bathroom. Cold itself changes habits. In many regions, people likely bathed more seasonally than regularly. Summer allowed easier washing in rivers or tubs. Warmer months reduced some of the discomfort and danger of soaking the body. Winter narrowed those opportunities. And in rural areas, where privacy was limited and labor was heavy, people had good reason to choose partial washing over full immersion most of the time. Yet, it would be a mistake to imagine uniformity. Medieval Europe was not a single culture with one bathing rule. Customs differed by class, region, religion, and century. Royal courts did not live like villages. Italian towns did not behave exactly like English hamlets. Monastic routines differed from urban guild life. In some places, bathing remained tied to medicine and luxury. In others, it was occasional but accepted. In still others, it became more restricted. That is one reason the broad claim that medieval people rarely bathed is both true and misleading. True because frequent full-body bathing was uncommon for many. Misleading because it suggests indifference when the real issue was variation, practicality, and a very different idea of what counted as proper cleanliness. And what did they do instead? They washed selectively and often intelligently, according to the standards and means available to them. Hands were especially important. Before meals, after labor, after travel, and in formal settings, hand-washing had both practical and ceremonial value. Basins and ewers appear often in medieval household culture for that reason. The face and neck could be wiped or rinsed. The mouth might be freshened with herbs, cloths, or rinses. The body could be rubbed down with clean cloth. Linen could be changed. Bedding could be aired. Rooms could be scented with rushes, flowers, or herbs, though not always in the romantic way later imagination prefers. People also used ointments, powders, and plant-based preparations. Soap existed, though its availability and quality varied widely, and it was often used more for laundry and textiles than for constant full-body washing. It is worth pausing here, because this is the quiet heart of the story. Medieval people were not choosing between cleanliness and filth in the way we often assume. They were choosing among methods. They were working within costs. They were interpreting the body through inherited medical ideas. They were balancing modesty, health, labor, fuel, season, status, and local custom. Once we see that, the question becomes less mocking and more human. How would any of us define cleanliness if hot water had to be hauled, if winter rooms were cold, if laundry mattered more than immersion, and if respected medical advice warned that opening the body too much could invite harm? Even the language of smell needs caution. We often assume that medieval people simply tolerated conditions that would seem unbearable to us. Certainly many places were smoky, crowded, and difficult by modern standards. Streets could be foul. Animals lived close to humans. Waste disposal was imperfect. But people were not numb to bad smells. On the contrary, odor had social and medical meaning. Fragrant substances were valued. Stench could be associated with corruption, disease, bad air, or moral disorder. The medieval nose was not less sensitive. It was trained in a different environment and attached to a different set of explanations. And that brings us toward an even deeper layer of the story. In many medieval settings, the body was not understood mainly as a private, sealed, modern individual possession. It was porous, relational, vulnerable to environment, diet, emotion, season, and invisible influences. If that sounds strange, it should, but it helps explain why bathing could never be a simple yes or no matter. To wash was not merely to remove dirt. It was to alter the body's condition. Sometimes that was desirable. Sometimes it was risky. Sometimes it was luxurious. Sometimes it was suspect. The same act could carry different meanings depending on who performed it, where, when, and why. So when later generations repeated the idea that medieval people hardly bathed, they preserved only the surface of a more complicated truth. They remembered the rarity of regular immersion, but forgot the systems of grooming, the role of linen, the weight of labor, the cost of fuel, the influence of medicine, and the social reputation of bathhouses. They reduced an entire world of bodily practice to a punchline. And like so many historical simplifications, that version tells us almost as much about modern assumptions as it does about the Middle Ages. The more closely we look, the more the old image begins to soften. We start to see not a population carelessly neglecting itself, but a society making choices inside the limits of its world. Some of those choices now seem odd. Some were probably unpleasant. Some were surprisingly sensible. And some, as we are about to see, were tied not only to health and custom, but to religion, status, and the slow reshaping of medieval daily life in ways that reached far beyond the wash basin. Because once cleanliness became connected to discipline, morality, and social order, the story of bathing became something much larger than water alone. Because once cleanliness became connected to discipline, morality, and social order, the story of bathing became something much larger than water alone. One of the clearest ways to understand that larger story is to move from the village path and the town bathhouse into the moral imagination of medieval Europe. People did not simply live in houses and streets. They lived inside systems of meaning. The body was part of that system. It could be honored, restrained, purified, humbled, protected, displayed, or corrected. And as the medieval centuries passed, washing and bathing were interpreted through those concerns again and again. This is important because it helps explain why something as ordinary as warm water could become entangled with questions of self-control, temptation, and respectability. Christianity, of course, did not teach that dirt itself was a virtue. Medieval people were not urged to become foul as a sign of holiness in any simple or universal sense. Monastic communities often required practical washing. Clergy washed their hands during religious ritual. Households connected bodily order with social order. But Christian thought did place great emphasis on inward purity over outward appearance, and that emphasis could shift the tone around bathing. Too much concern with the body, especially when joined to luxury, vanity, or sensual pleasure, could appear morally questionable. In that light, a long, comfortable, pleasure-filled bath was not always interpreted as innocent self-care. Could seem self-indulgent, could suggest softness. It could imply that one was paying too much attention to flesh and comfort. This was not true in every place or period, and it should not be exaggerated. Medieval religion was full of paradoxes. The body was created by God, but it was also weak. It was the site of temptation, but also of discipline. Could be cared for, yet it could not be allowed to rule the soul. So attitudes toward bathing tended to follow that tension. Washing for necessity, hospitality, medicine, or basic decency could be acceptable. Bathing for excessive comfort, sensuality, or display could attract criticism. A noble household might prepare a bath for a guest as an act of honor. A saint's life, by contrast, might praise someone who neglected bodily comfort as a mark of spiritual seriousness. The same society could hold both views at once. That duality becomes especially visible in stories of holy men and women. Medieval hagiography, the literature of saints' lives, often celebrated bodily discipline. Fasting, sleeplessness, coarse clothing, and a limited concern for comfort could all serve as signs of devotion. In some of these texts, reluctance to bathe appears as part of a larger rejection of vanity or worldly pleasure. But here too we must be careful. These were idealized lives, not average ones. They were written to inspire, instruct, and astonish. The point was often not hygiene but sacrifice. Later readers sometimes took such examples and imagined that all devout medieval people must have treated washing with suspicion. The evidence does not support that. What it shows instead is that certain religious ideals could lend prestige to physical austerity, and that prestige shaped the culture around bodily habits. At the same time, medieval elites never entirely gave up the link between cleanliness and rank. In fact, the higher one moved in society, the more visible bodily management could become. Royal and noble households recorded towels, basins, scented waters, bath vessels, and linen in account books and inventories. Servants attended to these details because appearance mattered. To be well presented was to display order, authority, and household competence. A disordered, noble body reflected badly on an entire domestic world. So while moralists might warn against luxury, elite society still valued refinement. This created another contradiction that runs through medieval life. Bodily restraint was admired, but bodily neglect could also damage status. Between those poles, people negotiated their habits as best they could. The same was true in towns, where reputation mattered intensely. Urban life placed people in close contact with neighbors, customers, guild members, apprentices, priests, and officials. A merchant, craft worker, or innkeeper did not need modern ideas of hygiene to understand the value of appearing orderly and respectable. Washed hands, trimmed hair, maintained clothing, and clean linen all contributed to trust. Much of daily cleanliness, then, was social rather than private. It was about being fit to appear before others. A person was not merely clean in isolation. He or she was presentable within a web of expectations. And that word, presentable, helps us understand why linen remained so central. Medieval laundering was laborious, but it was also visible evidence of discipline. Household women, servants, laundresses, and workers devoted enormous energy to textiles. Shirts, shifts, veils, towels, bedding, table linens, and cloths all demanded attention. Washing fabric required water, ash, soap where available, pounding, rinsing, wringing, drying, mending, and storage. It was repetitive, heavy work. Yet precisely because it was so demanding, fresh linen became a sign of care and order. In many households, the maintenance of cloth mattered more consistently than the immersion of bodies. That was not a failure of cleanliness. It was the practical center of it. There is another quiet historical twist here. When modern people imagine cleanliness, they tend to focus on skin. Medieval people often focused on surfaces around the skin as well. Beds, garments, tableware, towels, combs, wash basins, and sleeping spaces all formed part of the bodily environment. A cleaner body in a foul shirt was not truly clean by their standards. Nor was a washed face much use in a smoky, lice-ridden bed. So efforts at order often spread outward from the body into textiles and household objects. Cleanliness was ecological before it was individual, though of course the ecology was difficult to control. Lice, fleas, and skin conditions remind us of that difficulty. However thoughtful medieval grooming could be, people still lived close to animals, wool, rushes, smoke, damp timber, and often other people. Parasites were common. So were rashes, sores, and chronic irritations. This fact has sometimes been used to argue that medieval cleansing practices were obviously inadequate. But that judgment is too easy. Even much later societies with greater access to bathing still struggled with pests and disease. What matters historically is not whether medieval methods met modern expectations. It is whether they made sense within the world available to them. Combings, delousing, laundering, airing garments, changing bedding when possible, and selective washing were rational responses to persistent problems, even if they did not eliminate them. Medical bathing, meanwhile, followed its own path. Baths were often recommended not as daily hygiene, but as treatment. Mineral springs, heated baths, and controlled regimens could be prescribed for specific ailments. Here the bath becomes less a routine act and more a managed intervention. Physicians might advise it for dryness, stiffness, fatigue, or certain imbalances, while warning against it for others. Timing mattered. So did food, age, season, and bodily condition. A person might be told not to bathe after a meal, or not when weakened, or not for too long. This reinforces a point we have already begun to see. Medieval people did not divide the world cleanly into bathing versus not bathing. They sorted bathing into categories of useful, dangerous, respectable, excessive, medicinal, or suspect. Public bathhouses fit uneasily within all of these categories. In some medieval cities, they remained part of urban life for generations. A bathhouse might offer warmth, steam, tubs, food, company, and treatments. Could also serve travelers who lacked private facilities. In a cold climate, in a dense town, such places answered real needs. Yet their very usefulness gave them a certain moral ambiguity. Bathing required partial undress. Shared spaces blurred the boundaries of class and privacy. Eating and drinking could extend the visit. Men and women might attend at different times or, in some places and periods, under looser arrangements than moralists preferred. Add to this the possibility of prostitution or flirtation, and the bathhouse became a place that invited both custom and criticism. That criticism grew sharper over time, especially as urban governments and preachers tried to define acceptable behavior more closely. Some of this was sincere concern for public morality. Some of it was anxiety about disorderly spaces in general. Medieval authorities often worried about any environment where supervision weakened and different kinds of people mixed too freely. Taverns, fairs, gaming spaces, and bathhouses could all attract attention for that reason. A bathhouse was never just a place of washing. It was a social institution, and once social institutions acquired reputations, they could change very quickly in the public mind. Disease made that public reputation still more fragile. After the Black Death in the 14th century and through later waves of epidemic illness, Europeans searched desperately for explanations and protections. They did not understand contagion in modern microbiological terms, but they were observant. They saw patterns. They noticed when illness followed crowding, travel, seasonal change, poor air, or physical weakness. In many medical traditions of the time, heat opened the body, and open bodies could be endangered bodies. So communal hot bathing came under renewed suspicion. If the pores were open, if the air was corrupt, if the room was crowded, what might be entering the body? Even if the explanation was wrong by modern science, it was not irrational within the framework they had. This is one of the most useful moments in the whole story, because it turns a mockable habit into a recognizably human one. Faced with disease they could not control, medieval and early modern people adjusted behavior based on the best models available to them. Sometimes those adjustments were effective. Sometimes they were not. But they were responses, not indifference. Avoiding certain baths could feel like caution. Preferring dry rubbing, fresh linen, or limited washing could feel protective. Once fear of disease joined fear of moral disorder, the old culture of communal bathing became much harder to sustain. Regional differences, though, still mattered enormously. In parts of Central and Northern Europe, sweat bathing and steam traditions persisted in different forms. In the Islamic world, where bathing culture retained stronger institutional roots through the hammam, the relationship between religion, cleanliness, and public washing developed along a different path. Jewish communities too maintained ritual bathing traditions that complicate any simple account of medieval people as a single civilization. Even within Christian Europe, local habits could vary widely. So when we speak of medieval people rarely bathing, we are really speaking of broad tendencies within many Latin Christian contexts, not a universal law of the age. Class also kept shaping the picture. The wealthy could arrange baths more easily. They had servants, fuel, private chambers, and access to fine fabrics. Yet they were also vulnerable to criticism if comfort became extravagance. The poor had fewer means, but practical washing remained part of daily existence. A laborer returning muddy from the field might rinse off in a stream without ever calling it a bath in the ceremonial sense. A woman managing a household might wash children, cloth, dishes, and hands repeatedly throughout the week, while never enjoying the kind of soaking bath that later generations would imagine as standard cleanliness. That gap between modern category and medieval reality is easy to miss. Water was everywhere in labor, but not always in the form of leisure bathing. There is also the question of privacy, which modern audiences often underestimate. Bathing today is deeply private in many societies, protected by architecture and plumbing. Medieval homes did not always offer that privacy. Even in prosperous households, rooms served multiple functions. People slept in shared spaces. Servants moved through chambers. Screens and curtains could help, but not always completely. For poorer families, privacy was scarcer still. To undress fully, to heat enough water, and to remain warm before and after the bath was not merely inconvenient. It was logistically awkward and sometimes socially uncomfortable. Once again, occasional partial washing starts to look much less mysterious. Children, too, remind us that habits changed across the life cycle. Infants and small children were often washed more directly because they had to be. Caregivers handled their bodies in ways that adult privacy did not permit. The elderly or infirm might receive assistance in bathing or washing as part of household care. Brides, guests, the sick, and the noble dead could all be washed in more ceremonial ways. So medieval contact with bathing did not disappear. It concentrated around specific needs, moments, and statuses rather than becoming a universal daily routine. By the late medieval and early modern periods, another important shift was underway. Across Europe, ideas about civility and self-presentation slowly developed in ways that would later transform bodily habits even more deeply. Manuals of conduct, courtly expectations, and urban discipline began paying closer attention to gesture, table manners, dress, bodily restraint, and social polish. Yet, interestingly, this did not immediately produce the modern bath-centered ideal. Instead, it often strengthened the emphasis on linen, visible neatness, grooming, and control. A clean collar, a fresh shirt, a composed face, and restrained bodily behavior could signify refinement more effectively than immersion in water ever could. In other words, what looked civilized was changing, but not yet in the direction many modern viewers assume. And this creates one more gentle reversal. The Middle Ages are often imagined as a dirty prelude to a cleaner modern world. But the transition was not a straight line from ignorance to enlightenment. It was a shifting balance of medicine, morality, labor, technology, and etiquette. In some respects, certain public bathing customs declined before modern hygiene rose to replace them. That means there were moments when people may actually have bathed less communally, not because cleanliness mattered less, but because other fears and ideals mattered more. The result was a culture in which the body was constantly managed, but not always submerged. It was wiped, dressed, aired, combed, perfumed, covered, uncovered, examined, rubbed, and interpreted. It was read for signs of health and rank. It was disciplined by religion and custom. It was placed in relation to season, food, work, and air. Bathing sat inside that wider pattern rather than ruling it. And once we understand that wider pattern, the old stereotype begins to feel not just unfair, but historically lazy. Still, there remains an important question. If medieval people possessed practical methods of cleanliness, if they washed in selective ways, and if some bath traditions survived for centuries, why did the image of the unwashed Middle Ages become so powerful later on? Why did later Europeans, and then modern popular culture, become so eager to portray the medieval world as uniquely filthy, backward, and bodily crude? That answer leads us into the politics of memory, the Renaissance and early modern habit of defining the Middle Ages as an age of darkness, and the surprisingly long afterlife of a stereotype that says as much about those who repeated it as it does about the people who once lived by candlelight, clean linen, cold mornings, and a very different understanding of what it meant to keep the human body in order. Because the people who once lived by candlelight, clean linen, cold mornings, and a very different understanding of what it meant to keep the human body in order were later judged by standards they had never claimed for themselves. That judgment did not appear all at once. It developed gradually, as Europeans in later centuries began constructing a story about progress in which the medieval past served as a useful contrast. Renaissance writers, eager to celebrate their own return to classical learning, often portrayed the centuries between Rome and themselves as a period of decline. Protestant and Catholic reformers, each in different ways, criticized older habits in order to sharpen the identity of their own age. Enlightenment thinkers, with their love of order, reason, and improvement, found it convenient to describe the medieval world as confused, superstitious, and physically coarse. The body became part of that argument. To call the Middle Ages dirty was not just to describe hygiene. It was to declare a civilization inferior. This is one of those turns in history that looks obvious only after it has happened. Once later Europeans developed better plumbing in some places, stronger states, new medical theories, and more elaborate ideas of civility, they began reading the medieval body backwards. They assumed that because medieval people did not share their habits, they must not have cared about cleanliness at all. But historical evidence almost never supports such simple moral ladders. People do not usually move from filth to cleanliness in one straight civilizational march. They move between systems. They inherit one logic of the body, then replace it with another, often carrying forward older habits in disguised form. The irony is that some of the centuries that most looked down on medieval bathing were not yet fully modern in their own practices. In the 16th and 17th centuries, for example, frequent immersion bathing was still far from universal in many parts of Europe. Concerns about health, pores, vapor, and bodily vulnerability did not vanish overnight. Linen remained central. Perfumes, powders, and dry methods of freshness still mattered. Courtly society could be highly attentive to appearance while remaining cautious about water on the skin. In that sense, later Europeans often criticized the medieval past for patterns they themselves had not entirely abandoned. That contradiction is worth lingering over because it reveals how stereotypes work. They simplify by exaggerating difference. A 17th-century observer might imagine himself much cleaner and more refined than a 14th-century predecessor, even while sharing many assumptions about linen, air, and the dangers of overexposing the body. What had changed was partly practice, but also self-image. To be modern meant learning how to describe older centuries as backward. And once those descriptions entered textbooks, travel literature, satire, sermons, and polite conversation, they gained a life of their own. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the process deepened further. Urban reformers, doctors, and public health thinkers began linking dirt to disease with growing force, especially in the context of crowded industrial cities. Sewage, waste disposal, ventilation, housing reform, and access to water became urgent public matters. In that atmosphere, the medieval world was increasingly imagined as the opposite of sanitary civilization. Yet once again, the comparison was often unfair. Industrial cities produced forms of filth and crowding on a scale that many medieval towns would have found horrifying. Smoke, chemical runoff, packed tenements, and polluted waterways created new bodily dangers even as modern medicine slowly improved. The old story of the uniquely dirty medieval world obscured that modernity had generated its own forms of contamination. What kept the stereotype alive was not only evidence, but storytelling convenience. The Middle Ages became a stage on which modern people acted out their own sense of superiority. Popular writers loved the contrast. Dark streets, unwashed bodies, foul smells, crude manners, then eventually the dawn of cleanliness and reason. It made for an easy narrative. It still does. A sentence like "People in the Middle Ages never bathed" is simple, memorable, and mildly shocking. The truth, by contrast, requires patience. It asks us to distinguish between public and private bathing, between partial washing and full immersion, between medicine and morality, between different regions and centuries, between noble households and peasant labor, between stereotype and lived experience. The truthful version is better history, but it is less convenient myth. And myths, once they become visual, are very hard to dislodge. 19th century paintings, early museum displays, costume dramas, and later films all helped fix a particular image of the medieval body in the public imagination. Heavy fur, muddy roads, smoky halls, greasy hair, dark interiors, and comic indifference to smell became visual shorthand for the medieval. None of those details is entirely invented. Medieval life could indeed be muddy, smoky, cold, and physically demanding. But when every image is arranged to signal grime, the result is not careful historical reconstruction. It is atmosphere serving prejudice. Dirt becomes a costume for backwardness. Even the language we use today carries traces of that habit. To call something medieval is often to mean brutal, primitive, or unhygienic. That is less a description than an inheritance from centuries of cultural self-congratulation. Historians have spent a long time pushing back against it, not because they wish to romanticize the Middle Ages, but because the period deserves to be understood on its own terms. Medieval people had diseases, parasites, and difficult living conditions, certainly. But they also had standards, routines, and beliefs about care. They noticed dirt. They valued fresh textiles. They washed strategically. They worried about smell. They interpreted the body through a framework that now feels strange, but it was still a framework of maintenance and meaning. There is a subtler lesson here as well. Every age thinks some of its own bodily practices are simply obvious. Showers feel obvious to us. Deodorant feels obvious. Running water feels normal. But those habits depend on infrastructure, chemistry, architecture, labor systems, and cultural values that are not timeless. They feel natural because we were raised inside them. Medieval practices felt natural to medieval people for the same reason. If they thought a clean shirt mattered more than a hot bath, that was not because they had failed to grasp cleanliness. It was because their world organized cleanliness differently. History becomes more humane the moment we begin from that premise. And once we do, the question, what did they do instead, opens up still further. They did not merely replace the bath with a cloth and move on. They built a whole hierarchy of bodily care. At the top were occasional baths, sometimes luxurious, sometimes medicinal, sometimes communal, sometimes private. Beneath that were regular washings of hands, face, and feet, depending on circumstance. Then came the constant work of linens, the maintenance of beds and coverings, the use of combs, shears, and cloths, the inspection of the skin, the treatment of hair, the scenting of garments, the attention to breath and table manners, the routines of prayer and ritual washing, the adaptation to seasons, and the countless small gestures that made a person feel presentable. Those gestures mattered because the body was never only biological. It was social theater. A host offered handwashing before a meal not merely to remove dirt, but to show order and respect. A priest washing at the altar did more than cleanse his skin. He performed purity before the congregation. A noble lady changing linen displayed household discipline and wealth. A merchant arriving with orderly dress and washed hands signaled reliability. A monk managing bodily habits according to rules signaled obedience. Once again, the body was read by others. That is why even small acts of washing carried meaning. If we look closely at medieval dining customs, we can see this clearly. In many households, especially among those with means, guests were offered water for washing before eating. Hands mattered because much food was handled directly. To sit at table with unwashed hands would be discourteous and potentially offensive. Here cleanliness was linked to hospitality, rank, and ritual order. The basin, the ewer, the towel, and the servant who presented them were all part of a small ceremony of social trust. No one in that setting was indifferent to bodily presentation. The concern was specific, visible, and immediate. Feet, too, occupy an interesting place in medieval practice. Foot washing had practical uses, especially for travelers or laborers, but it also had deep symbolic resonance in Christian culture. Ceremonial foot washing appeared in monastic settings, charitable ritual, and royal displays of humility. This reminds us that washing in the Middle Ages could carry meanings far beyond comfort. Could express piety, service, reversal of hierarchy, or imitation of sacred example. So even when full-body bathing was limited, washing remained charged with significance. The same can be said of childbirth, illness, and death. Bodies at their most vulnerable drew out some of the most careful forms of washing and handling. Midwives and household women attended to mothers and infants with practical routines of cleansing, wrapping, and linen management. The sick might be sponged, wiped, or bathed according to strength and advice. The dead were often washed and prepared with reverence before burial. These acts show that when the body mattered most, medieval households knew perfectly well how to care for it materially. They may not have done so with modern antiseptic theory, but they did so with seriousness. One reason modern audiences miss all this is that we tend to reserve the word clean for certain visible outcomes. We associate cleanliness with sparkling surfaces, white tile, soap fragrance, and abundant hot water. Medieval cleanliness was quieter and less total. It was often local, temporary, and embedded in labor. A shirt fresh from washing might matter more than skin soaked in scented water. A combed head and clean hands might matter more than a full bath 2 days earlier. A bed newly aired in the sun could count for much. These priorities reflect material realities, but they also reflect a philosophy of the body. Cleanliness was managed through contact layers, not just through skin. Soap itself complicates the story further. Soap was known in medieval Europe, and in some regions it was manufactured with increasing sophistication. But availability, cost, and use varied widely. The finest soaps could be associated with wealth or special uses. Rougher cleansing substances, lye mixtures, or ash-based preparations might be used more often in household work than directly on the body. In many places, the most reliable target of soap was cloth. Again, we see the same pattern. The medieval route to bodily care often passed through textiles first. Then there is water quality. Not every source of water was equally desirable for bathing. Wells could be hard to access. Rivers could be cold, dangerous, or polluted by nearby use. Standing water might be unpleasant or suspect. Urban water systems, where they existed, were limited and vulnerable. In some places, communal fountains served drinking and household needs, but those needs competed with each other. A modern household can separate drinking water, bath water, laundry water, and sewage with little thought. Medieval communities often could not. So choices about washing were also choices about allocation. Who would carry water? For what purpose? At what cost? How often? Seen in that light, one of the oldest jokes about the Middle Ages begins to dissolve. The problem was not that people lacked the idea of a clean body. It was that achieving a modern-style clean body would have required an enormous transformation in infrastructure and domestic labor. Aqueducts had once supported public bathing in the Roman world, though not everywhere equally and not forever. When those systems declined or became harder to sustain in many regions, habits changed. And adaptation, more than anything, is the key theme running underneath this entire history. Medieval people adapted Roman inheritances, Christian teachings, local climates, available fuels, medical traditions, and class expectations into a practical set of bodily habits. Later, Europeans adapted those habits again. Then industrial and modern societies transformed them yet again under the pressure of science, urban growth, and technology. Cleanliness is never static. It moves with the shape of the world around it. There is a quiet challenge in that realization. It asks us to abandon the comforting idea that we are simply cleaner because we are wiser. In reality, we are cleaner in certain ways because our societies built pipes, boilers, municipal water systems, sewage treatment, chemical industries, private bathrooms, washing machines, and vast energy networks. Our habits rest on hidden labor too, only it is organized differently. Medieval people saw their labor directly. Water was lifted by hand, fuel was burned in the room, cloth was scrubbed by muscle, and the body was maintained within sight of the work that sustained it. Perhaps that is one reason their priorities appear so strange to us. Their system was visible in ways ours often is not. And still, despite all these corrections and complications, the older image retains a strange power. People like to imagine the medieval world as a place where everyone smelled terrible and never bathed because it provides a satisfying contrast with the present. It reassures modern audiences that progress is real, tangible, and intimate. But good history usually begins where reassurance ends. It begins when a caricature starts to feel unstable. It begins when a joke gives way to a system. It begins when we ask not whether medieval people matched us, but what made sense within their own houses, streets, monasteries, castles, bathhouses, workshops, and fields. Once we ask that, other details start to become visible almost by themselves. We begin to notice why rank shaped access to washing. We begin to see why a monastery might regulate baths differently from a court. We begin to understand why fear of disease could alter bodily habits for generations. We begin to recognize the body as a meeting point of religion, medicine, labor, and climate. And perhaps most interestingly of all, we begin to realize that medieval Europe was not the only world wrestling with these questions. Other civilizations, living at the same time, made different choices about bathing, steam, ritual washing, and public hygiene. Those contrasts can sharpen our picture of medieval Europe not by mocking it, but by placing it beside societies where water, architecture, and religion supported very different routines. And it is at that wider edge of the story, where Europe stops looking inevitable and starts looking comparative, that the question of why medieval people rarely bathed begins opening into something even larger than medieval Europe itself. Because it is at that wider edge of the story, where Europe stops looking inevitable and starts looking comparative, that the question of why medieval people rarely bathed begins opening into something even larger than medieval Europe itself. If we widen the lens just a little, the medieval European habit of cautious, selective washing stops looking like a universal human norm and starts looking like one cultural solution among many. In the Byzantine world, in Islamic cities, in parts of the Jewish diaspora, and across regions shaped by older Roman or Eastern bathing traditions, the relationship between the body and water could look very different. That comparison matters not because it allows us to rank civilizations too easily, but because it helps us see medieval Europe more clearly. It reminds us that bathing customs were not determined by some fixed stage of human development. They were shaped by theology, law, urban design, fuel supply, inherited institutions, and the ordinary question of what people considered healthy, decent, and practical. Take the Islamic world, for example, where public bathing remained deeply embedded in urban life through the hammam. There, washing was supported not only by architecture and custom, but by religious practice. Ritual purity mattered. Certain forms of washing were tied to prayer, bodily states, and social life. That did not mean everyone was perpetually clean in a modern sense, or that water was infinitely abundant, or that all places followed the same standard. But it did mean that the cultural place of bathing stayed stronger and more institutionally secure than in many parts of Latin Christian Europe. Bathhouses were not merely tolerated conveniences. They were often expected parts of city life, woven into the rhythms of worship, hospitality, and civic routine. That contrast is especially useful because it shows us something simple but important. If two societies living in the broad medieval era could treat bathing so differently, then the explanation cannot be reduced to technology alone. Belief mattered. Institutions mattered. The body's place in sacred life mattered. In parts of Christian Europe, bodily openness through heat and moisture might arouse suspicion under certain medical and moral frameworks. In Islamic settings, structured washing could carry a different religious authority. Neither society was simply cleaner or dirtier in any crude absolute sense. They were organizing bodily care according to different priorities. Jewish communities likewise carried ritual traditions that complicate the old stereotype. The existence of the mikveh and the broader concern with ritual purity in Jewish law meant that washing and immersion had meanings not captured by the lazy phrase, "medieval people didn't bathe." Once again, medieval Europe was never one single block of practice. Christians, Jews, and Muslims living in overlapping geographies could inhabit very different bodily cultures, even while sharing towns, trade routes, climates, and political pressures. To say medieval people without qualification begins to feel less and less useful the longer we stay with the evidence. And then there is Byzantium, heir in many ways to Roman urbanism and Roman habits, though not unchanged. In Byzantine cities, the legacy of public bathing survived more visibly than in much of Western Europe. Roman infrastructure did not simply disappear at one fixed moment. It persisted in some places, weakened in others, and was repurposed according to local conditions. This too complicates the story. Western Europe's gradual retreat from some communal bathing habits was not the inevitable destiny of all post-Roman societies. It was a regional development shaped by fragmented political authority, shifting urban life, altered economic capacity, and changing religious and medical attitudes. Once we see these neighboring worlds beside each other, medieval Europe begins to look less like the natural middle stage between Rome and modernity and more like a patchwork civilization making particular decisions under particular conditions. This is one of the quiet pleasures of historical comparison. It removes the illusion that the path later taken by Western Europe was the only path available. It makes the familiar world slightly strange again. And when the familiar becomes strange, better questions start to appear. For example, why did Western Europe not preserve stronger bathing institutions where it could? Why were some Roman habits maintained in certain towns yet weakened elsewhere? Why did moral suspicion gather so effectively around bathhouses in some periods? Why did linen and selective washing grow into such powerful alternatives? These are not just questions about water. They are questions about what kind of society Western Europe was becoming. Part of the answer lies in the medieval household itself. The household was the real engine of bodily maintenance. It was where labor was organized, cloth was washed, fuel was managed, children were raised, food was prepared, and daily order was made visible. Public institutions mattered, certainly, but most people encountered cleanliness first through household routines rather than through city-scale systems. This is especially important in rural Europe, where the majority of the population lived for much of the medieval period. A peasant household did not need a theory of public hygiene in order to care about cleanliness. It needed enough labor, enough time, enough cloth, enough fuel, and enough water to maintain a workable standard of life. That standard, unsurprisingly, looked different from urban bathing culture. Within the household, women carried much of this burden, though of course servants, children, hired workers, and other kin all played roles depending on status and region. Laundry was physically punishing work. So was hauling water. So was caring for the sick, washing children, airing bedding, and maintaining garments in climates that could shift from wet cold to summer heat. When we ask why medieval people did not bathe more often, we should also ask who would have made those baths possible. The answer is not abstract. It is human labor, often female labor, often repetitive, often invisible to later storytellers. The history of cleanliness is also a history of work that goes unnoticed precisely because it was ordinary. That unnoticed labor helps explain why linen mattered so much. Linen could travel through the cycle of washing and wearing more flexibly than the body could travel through the cycle of heating water, bathing, drying, and recovering warmth. A family might not be able to offer full immersion often, but it could still manage degrees of bodily freshness by rotating underclothes, wiping exposed skin, grooming the hair, and keeping sleeping spaces as orderly as circumstances allowed. Those efforts were not glamorous enough to survive in popular memory, but they formed the real texture of daily care. This is where the modern imagination often fails. It looks for one dramatic sign of cleanliness and misses the many smaller signs medieval people actually used. A washed hand before eating, clean shift, a comb drawn carefully through hair, a cloth to the face and neck, a basin brought to a guest, bedding aired in sunlight, a child scrubbed, an old man sponged by family, herbs placed among textiles. These acts do not fit the stereotype of medieval dirt because they are too modest. But history is often built from modest things. At the same time, we should not soften the past so much that it becomes falsely comfortable. Medieval life could be physically harsh. There were smells modern people would find difficult. There were parasites, skin ailments, smoke-filled interiors, unpaved streets, animal waste, damp walls, and winters that made the ordinary acts of washing deeply unpleasant. A balanced account has to hold both realities together. Medieval people cared about cleanliness, but they lived in conditions that made complete control impossible. Their standards were practical rather than total. They could manage the body. They could not sterilize the world. And perhaps that is one reason smell occupied such an interesting place in medieval thinking. Smell was immediate, social, and morally charged. Sweetness could suggest health, wealth, sanctity, or refinement. Stench could suggest corruption, sickness, decay, bad air, poverty, or danger. Medieval writers noticed odors constantly. They did not ignore them. They interpreted them. That interpretation shaped behavior. Incense, herbs, flowers, pomanders, smoke, rushes on the floor, and fresh cloth were not merely decorative. They were part of an atmosphere people believed mattered to bodily and spiritual well-being. This concern with atmosphere leads us naturally back into medical theory, because medieval medicine cared deeply about the environment entering the body. Air, diet, sleep, exercise, emotional state, evacuation, and surrounding conditions all influenced health. What later medicine would call hygiene was distributed across many categories. To preserve health was not simply to wash. It was to balance. A man might be advised to walk, to avoid heavy foods, to sleep appropriately, to keep a cheerful disposition, to prevent stagnation, to beware foul air, and to bathe only under certain conditions. In that larger system, bathing was one tool among many, not the unquestioned master practice of bodily care. That also helps explain why bathing could sometimes appear almost luxurious in literature and records. Because it was exceptional, it marked moments. A traveler arriving exhausted at a noble house might be offered a bath as part of hospitality. A bride might be prepared with ceremonial washing. A king or great lord might bathe before a feast, festival, or coronation context. A patient might be directed toward a bath as therapy. These are not signs of a society ignorant of bathing. They are signs of a society that reserved it for significance. The bath was memorable because it was not ordinary. And yet, in some settings, it could still be ordinary enough. This is where chronology matters. Early medieval Europe inherited more Roman and local bathing habits than later caricatures suggest. In some towns, bathhouses survived or were revived. In certain German cities, for example, bath culture could be vigorous well into the later Middle Ages. In parts of Central Europe, civic bathhouses remained familiar features of urban life. So even within Latin Christendom, the story was never a smooth decline from Roman bathing to medieval avoidance. It was uneven, localized, and reversible. A place might sustain bathing traditions for centuries while another lost them more quickly. Why, then, does the simplified story remain so tempting? Because simplification gives the comfort of certainty. It is easier to say medieval people rarely bathed, and imagine one solid age of grime than to admit a patchwork of customs stretching across 1,000 years. But 1,000 years is a very long time. It contains monasteries and marketplaces, plague years and prosperous courts, frontier villages and port cities, reform movements and festive seasons. It contains wet northern climates and warmer southern zones. It contains Christian theologians suspicious of vanity and urban officials licensing bathhouses for practical use. The longer the period, the more suspicious we should become of any sentence that sounds final. There is another dimension we have only touched lightly so far, and it brings us closer to the emotional texture of medieval daily life. Shame. Bodies are always social, and social bodies are always vulnerable to embarrassment. To smell wrong, to carry visible dirt, to be infested, to show skin unexpectedly, to expose illness, to lack clean linen, to wash in a setting that invited gossip, all of these things could produce anxiety. Medieval people did not need modern ideals of privacy to feel such pressures. In some ways, limited privacy can intensify them. When life is shared more closely, the body is observed more constantly. Reputation matters more. Habits of modesty, concealment, and selective washing develop partly in response. This may be one reason why the line between bathing and sexuality became so charged in some sources. To undress was never merely practical. It risked display. It risked mixing categories that society wanted to keep separate. The bathhouse, therefore, became symbolically unstable. Was it a place of health, leisure, temptation, treatment, sociability, or disorder? Different observers answered differently, and their answers changed over time. Once suspicion began to dominate, the institution could decline not because washing itself had been rejected, but because the social scene around washing had become morally unreliable. That moral unreliability intersected with class tensions as well. Communal spaces often trouble hierarchical societies because they bring bodies into proximity. Clothing can mark status from a distance. Naked or semi-naked bodies disrupt some of those signals, even if not completely. Bathhouses therefore posed subtle questions about order. Who sat beside whom? Who served and who was served? Who could enter? Who controlled the space? Such questions matter especially in cities where guilds, merchants, laborers, clergy, and travelers all met under pressure. Bathing was never just about the body in water. It was about the body in society. And that is why the decline of communal bathing in many areas should not be read too narrowly. It was part of a broader reorganization of space, morality, fear, and social discipline. Houses became more important as sites of controlled bodily life. Linen remained central because it was domestic and governable. Selective washing fit better into the rhythms of work and modesty. Medical cautions gave these choices intellectual support. Moral criticism gave them cultural weight. Disease fears gave them urgency. Slowly, what might once have seemed normal in a bathhouse began to seem questionable, then undesirable, then old-fashioned, and eventually, for some later observers, embarrassingly medieval. But the most revealing part of all may be this. Even as public bathing declined or changed in parts of Europe, people did not stop trying to manage bodily freshness. They simply moved that effort into forms that left fewer dramatic traces. This is why historians have to read carefully. Account books listing towels and basins, household ordinances about laundering, monastic rules concerning wash days, medical manuals advising hot baths only in certain circumstances, moral treatises warning against luxury, archaeological remains of combs, basins, and bath structures, literary scenes of hospitality and preparation. None of these pieces alone tells the whole story. Together, they reveal a civilization that thought about the body constantly, even when it did not wash in the way we expected. And perhaps that is the deepest twist in the entire subject. The cliché says medieval people did not care. The evidence suggests the opposite. They cared enough to argue, regulate, improvise, moralize, medicalize, and ritualize bodily care in many different ways. Their problem was not indifference. It was that cleanliness sat at the crossroads of too many pressures to be simple. Work pulled one way, religion another, medicine another, climate another, status another. The body stood in the middle, trying to remain acceptable, healthy, and ordered within the limits of its time. If we listen closely enough, the old joke begins to sound almost childish beside that complexity. What replaces it is not a romantic fantasy of a sweet-smelling Middle Ages. It is something better, a world of hard labor, layered beliefs, practical ingenuity, social pressure, and ordinary maintenance. A world in which a basin on a stand, a folded linen shirt, a bar of costly soap, a steaming bathhouse, a sermon against vanity, a physician's warning, and a bundle of herbs hanging in a chamber were all connected by one persistent human concern. How do you care for the body in a world that does not make that care easy? And that question becomes sharper still when we move from the general habits of ordinary life into moments of crisis, because it was in times of plague, war, famine, migration, and urban crowding that medieval ideas about bathing, smell, corruption, and bodily vulnerability were truly tested, and those tests would reshape not just the use of water, but the emotional meaning of cleanliness for generations that followed. Because it was in times of plague, war, famine, migration, and urban crowding that medieval ideas about bathing, smell, corruption, and bodily vulnerability were truly tested, and those tests would reshape not just the use of water, but the emotional meaning of cleanliness for generations that followed. When daily life is relatively stable, habits can remain practical and almost invisible. A family washes as it usually washes. A town keeps or neglects its bathhouse according to custom. A monastery follows its rules. A merchant changes linen when he can, and a physician offers advice according to inherited authorities. But crisis changes the emotional temperature of everything. It gives ordinary acts new meanings. Water no longer feels like water alone. Smell no longer feels like a nuisance alone. Crowding no longer feels merely inconvenient. Under pressure, the body becomes something people watch with fear, and once fear enters a bodily routine, that routine is rarely the same again. The Black Death, beginning in the mid-14th century and followed by recurrent outbreaks for generations, did not create medieval anxieties about the body from nothing. Those anxieties were already there in medical theory, in religious thought, and in ordinary experiences of illness. But plague intensified them to an almost unimaginable degree. Communities saw people sicken quickly, households collapse, familiar neighbors disappear, and normal rhythms of work and worship break under the weight of repeated mortality. In such a climate, every explanation mattered. Every warning mattered. Even imperfect theories could shape behavior powerfully if they seemed to offer a little control. Medieval medical thinking did not understand plague through germs, but it did understand contagion through a mixture of contact, corruption, atmosphere, and susceptibility. Bad air, foul vapors, rotting matter, unbalanced bodies, and dangerous openings all formed part of the picture. To modern ears, some of this sounds misguided. Yet, from within their own framework, it produced a recognizable logic. If disease moved through corrupted air, then smell mattered. If heat opened the pores and rendered the body more penetrable, then a hot bath might feel dangerous in certain conditions. If weakness invited illness, then over-relaxing the body could appear reckless. If crowded spaces intensified exposure, then communal bathhouses might attract suspicion. This is one of the most important moments in the whole documentary, because it shows how a practical habit can be slowly reclassified into a risk. A public bathhouse might once have meant warmth, sociability, and relief. After plague, or in the shadow of recurring epidemic fear, the same place could look like a chamber of vulnerability. Steam, shared vessels, damp air, warm skin, exposed flesh, and other people's bodies all took on a different emotional charge. No ordinance was needed to make that transformation absolute. Sometimes a gradual change in feeling was enough. People need not stop bathing entirely for bath culture to weaken. They only need to become more cautious, more selective, and more willing to believe that other forms of care are safer. What is striking is how often medieval and early modern responses to plague involved not more water, but more management of atmosphere. Fires were lit. Windows were considered. Herbs and incense were burned. Sweet smells were cultivated to oppose foul ones. Streets could be cleaned or at least discussed as sources of corruption. The air itself became a medical object. That emphasis reveals once more that cleanliness did not center only on skin. It centered on the relation between body and environment. A clean body in bad air could still be endangered. A scented room could feel more protective than a long soak. Whether or not these strategies worked by modern scientific standards, they shaped behavior because they made sense in the world people thought they inhabited. War brought a different kind of pressure, though sometimes with similar results. Medieval warfare disrupted settlements, strained food supplies, displaced people, and damaged the fragile infrastructure that made daily order possible. Campaigning armies left waste, consumed local resources, and filled roads and towns with strangers. Refugees crowded into cities or religious houses. Wells and mills could be contested or damaged. In such conditions, bodily maintenance becomes harder even before disease enters the picture. Water is harder to allocate. Labor is harder to spare. Clothing wears out faster. Laundry becomes more difficult. Privacy shrinks. People wash less not because they have abandoned standards, but because the world around them has become unstable. Famine and poor harvests, too, altered the meaning of bathing in subtle ways. In years of scarcity, fuel mattered more, time mattered more, bodily weakness mattered more. A warm bath, already labor-intensive in ordinary times, could seem still less necessary beside hunger, debt, and the work of survival. And in a culture shaped by humoral medicine, a weakened body was not something to expose casually to heat, cold, or exhaustion. If bathing seemed draining under the wrong conditions, then scarcity itself might reinforce caution. Once again, the body was judged according to circumstance, not according to an abstract rule. Urban crowding deserves special attention because it ties together so many strands of the story. Medieval towns and cities were not static places. They expanded, contracted, rebuilt, and improvised. Trade brought wealth, but also movement. Workshops, inns, markets, and religious institutions packed people together in ways rural life did not. With that density came opportunity, but also smell, waste, noise, disease, and social friction. City governments tried, with varying success, to regulate cleanliness in streets, drains, butchers' quarters, markets, and waterways. Their efforts remind us that medieval officials were not indifferent to urban filth. They recognized it as a practical and civic problem. but the solutions available were limited, contested, and unevenly enforced. This is where modern viewers often make a quiet mistake. They imagine that because a medieval town could be dirty, nobody understood the value of keeping it cleaner. But understanding is not the same as capacity. Authorities could order waste removed and still fail to transform the street. They could regulate slaughtering and still struggle with runoff. They could worry about latrines, refuse heaps, and stagnant water and still lack the means to reorganize a crowded urban environment completely. The same is true at the household level. People can care deeply about cleanliness and still live with conditions they would rather change. And so crisis did not simply reveal the limits of medieval bathing culture. It hardened them into memory and instinct. Once communities had lived through repeated epidemics, once physicians had warned about bodily vulnerability, once preachers had associated certain spaces with disorder, and once domestic habits had adjusted around selective washing and linen care, the avoidance of frequent full-body bathing could begin to feel not just normal but prudent. That feeling might persist even when the original reasons were half forgotten. Habits often outlast the arguments that created them. At the same time, crisis also intensified the labor of care. When disease entered a household, someone had to tend the sick, wash cloths, handle bedding, manage waste, prepare food, and maintain some degree of order amid fear. Women, servants, religious caregivers, and kin bore much of that burden. Their work rarely appears in heroic language, but it is central to the history of cleanliness. The medieval body was not maintained only by theories from physicians or rules from priests. It was maintained by repeated acts of washing, carrying, sorting, drying, wiping, and replacing, often performed under strain. To understand what people did instead of bathing, we have to keep returning to that physical work because it was the real machinery of bodily life. There is a softer but equally revealing point here. In times of crisis, people often cling more tightly to manageable rituals. A washed hand, a fresh cloth, a room aired, herbs laid near the bed, a basin brought with care, a shirt changed at the right moment. These things can offer a sense of order when larger forces feel uncontrollable. That emotional role matters. Medieval washing practices were not only about removing dirt or following medical advice. They also helped people preserve dignity. To keep some order around the body, even in illness, was to resist chaos. A person might not control plague, but he or she could still control linen, water in a basin, the arrangement of the bed, the neatness of the room, or the scent of the chamber. This is particularly clear in the care of the dying and the dead. Medieval death was often physically intimate. Families, neighbors, clergy, and household members saw the body closely. They prepared it, wrapped it, watched over it. Washing after death was not merely practical. It was reverent. It imposed order at the edge of disorder. It acknowledged the body's significance even as life left it. That ritual seriousness reminds us, again, that medieval people did not treat bodies casually. They handled them within a framework of meaning, obligation, and respect. The same seriousness can be seen in childbirth. Medieval childbirth was dangerous, messy, exhausting, and deeply communal within the female networks that supported it. Water, cloth, wrapping, washing, and warmth all played roles. Midwives and attendants understood through experience that bodily care around birth mattered enormously. Their knowledge was practical rather than theoretical in the modern academic sense, but it was knowledge all the same. So when we ask whether medieval people bathed, we should remember that women who managed births, children, illness, and household maintenance encountered bodily fluids and cleansing needs constantly. The story of bathing is inseparable from the story of caregiving. There is another quiet reversal here. The popular stereotype imagines the Middle Ages as unconcerned with bodies. In reality, the period may have been concerned with bodies almost to the point of obsession. Bodies were watched for signs of sin, disease, fertility, rank, sanctity, weakness, labor, age, and corruption. They were interpreted by medicine and disciplined by religion. They were displayed ceremonially and hidden modestly. They were scented, covered, washed, and judged. The issue was never a lack of concern. It was that the concern was distributed differently than it is in modern hygienic culture. This helps explain why bathing could remain ambiguous even as cleanliness remained important. A bath was not a transparent good. It was a powerful bodily event. Heated, softened, opened, relaxed, exposed, and consumed resources. That made it useful in some settings, suspicious in others. Cloth, by contrast, was modest. Linen was controllable. Comb was safe. Handwashing was visible and socially legible. These lower-intensity practices fitted more easily into the moral and medical rhythm of daily life. Full immersion occupied a more unstable position, and instability tends to create regional variety. In one town, a bathhouse survives because civic custom, economic demand, and local tolerance support it. In another, it declines because disease fear and moral criticism combine against it. In one monastery, baths are carefully regulated but allowed. In another, they are rarer. In one aristocratic household, a bath marks celebration or treatment. In another, fresh linen and perfumed cloths do most of the work. This diversity is not a problem for history. It is the texture of history. The more closely we examine the record, the less likely we are to believe in one medieval attitude shared by everyone. Still, broad patterns remain visible. By the later medieval and early modern periods, much of Western Europe seems to have leaned away from frequent communal bathing and toward more selective, domestic, and linen-centered cleanliness. That trend was supported by medical caution, moral pressure, practical labor costs, and the memory of epidemic danger. It did not produce universal filth. It produced a different regime of bodily care. The modern eye, trained to identify the bath as the center of cleanliness, mistakes that regime for neglect. But within its own logic, it was often disciplined, thoughtful, and entirely serious. We can see the consequences of that logic in small but telling objects. The basin by the bedside or dining chamber. The ewer passed from servant to guest. The chest of linens stored carefully against damp and pests. The comb tucked into a personal kit. The folded towel. The scented pouch. The warming pan. The cauldron in which water might sometimes be heated for washing. The wooden tub that appears not as a daily fixture, but as an occasional tool. Material culture tells the story quietly. It shows a civilization that invested in the apparatus of selective washing even when it did not build everyday life around repeated immersion. And if we pay attention to literature, the same pattern emerges there in emotional form. Baths in medieval stories often appear at moments of transition. Before marriage, after travel, before feasting, as hospitality, as healing, as restoration. Their very presence marks a shift. They are noticed because they are meaningful. The routine washing of hands and face, by contrast, often passes with less comment because it belongs to ordinary life. In narrative terms, baths are events, washing is habit. That imbalance in the sources can mislead us because it makes bathing look rarer than bodily care really was, while also making it seem more ceremonial than practical. In truth, it was both. This also means that the decline of bathhouses should not be read as the collapse of all water culture. Rivers, fountains, wells, laundries, kitchens, breweries, mills, and monastic complexes all remained organized around water. People touched water constantly in work. They just did not always use it in the modern hygienic pattern. The body passed through a water-rich world without necessarily receiving a hot full-body bath each week. That distinction is easy to miss from a distance, but once seen, it changes everything. There is a final complication in this part of the story, and it has to do with memory inside the medieval period itself. People living in the later Middle Ages were not cut off from all sense of earlier bathing cultures. Roman ruins stood in the landscape. Some hot springs remained known. Some civic traditions preserved older patterns. Some texts described ancient practices. In other words, medieval Europeans were not completely unaware that other ages and places had bathed more extensively. Their choices were not made in innocence. They were made in relation to a fragmented inheritance. The past was present, but not fully recoverable. What remained were pieces. Ruins, habits, stories, institutions, and occasional revivals. That fragmented inheritance made the subject of bathing especially unstable, because it belonged partly to memory and partly to current necessity. A culture could admire Roman grandeur and still not rebuild Roman bathing systems. It could inherit a bathhouse and still moralize against what happened inside it. It could praise bodily purity in one register and distrust hot water in another. Medieval Europe lived inside those tensions for centuries. That is why the answer to our original question keeps widening the more carefully we examine it. So by the time later Europeans looked back and said, with easy confidence, that medieval people rarely bathed, they were flattening several layers at once. They flattened crisis into custom. They flattened selective washing into non-washing. They flattened regional variety into one stereotype. They flattened the labor of linen, grooming, and household care into invisibility. And perhaps most of all, they flattened fear into ignorance. Yet fear of disease, of moral disorder, of bodily vulnerability, of social shame, was one of the great hidden engines of medieval cleanliness. It did not abolish care. It redirected it. That redirection, once established, would not remain confined to the Middle Ages. It would continue shaping elite manners, domestic routines, medical theories, and bodily ideals well into the centuries that followed, when Europeans who believed themselves far beyond the medieval world were still dressing the skin in fresh linen, regulating exposure to water, worrying about the dangers of opening the pores, and carrying forward more of that older mental world than they fully realized. Because Europeans who believed themselves far beyond the medieval world were still dressing the skin in fresh linen, regulating exposure to water, worrying about the dangers of opening the pores, and carrying forward more of that older mental world than they fully realized. This is where the story becomes even more interesting, because it forces us to let go of the comforting boundary between medieval and modern. We often imagine a clean break. On one side, the supposedly dirty Middle Ages. On the other, a newer Europe discovering hygiene, refinement, and reason. But when we look closely at the 16th, 17th, and even 18th centuries, that division begins to dissolve. Many of the assumptions that shaped medieval bathing habits did not vanish when the calendar changed. They lingered, adapted, and in some places grew even stronger. The fear that water might weaken the body, the belief that linen preserved cleanliness more safely than immersion, the suspicion that the pores could admit danger, the moral unease surrounding bodily indulgence. All of this survived well beyond the medieval centuries. In fact, one of the quietest historical surprises is that some Europeans in the early modern period may have bathed less often in the full immersive sense than certain people in earlier medieval towns with functioning bathhouses. That runs directly against the easy narrative of progress, which is one reason it so rarely appears in popular retellings. But it makes sense once we remember how strongly fear of disease, moral discipline, and elite etiquette could shape habits. Bathing did not disappear because people became less civilized. It often declined because civilized behavior was being redefined in ways that made immersion seem unnecessary, risky, or faintly improper. Courtly culture is especially revealing here. In the growing courts of early modern Europe, bodily presentation became more exacting, but not always more water-centered. Appearance mattered enormously. Skin, clothing, Hair, scent, gesture, and posture all had to be managed carefully. Yet the preferred route to refinement often passed through frequent linen changes, grooming, perfuming, powders, and visible neatness rather than through regular hot bathing. The body was curated. It was polished at the surface. It was made legible to others as disciplined, controlled, and socially elevated. That is not the same thing as being unclean. It is a different system of cleanliness, one that still carried medieval assumptions inside it. There is a reason linen remained so emotionally central for so long. Linen touched the skin directly. It absorbed moisture, could be changed. It could be displayed at cuffs, collars, and necklines as a visible sign of order. Fine white linen in particular became associated with civility, wealth, self-command, and domestic competence. To keep linen fresh was to signal not only cleanliness, but a whole moral and social world functioning properly behind the scenes. Servants had done their work. Laundresses had done theirs. The household had resources and discipline. A person stepping into view in fresh linen was, in effect, carrying the evidence of an organized life on the body. That is one reason later Europeans could feel quite confident in their own cleanliness even without frequent immersion. They were clean according to the standards that mattered most in their social environment. They changed shirts. They washed hands and face. They combed, powdered, scented, and maintained their outer presentation. They kept visible disorder under control. From their perspective, that could be entirely sufficient. The modern observer, who treats bathing as the central ritual of bodily care, sees a gap. But the people themselves did not necessarily experience that gap in the same way. Medical language continued to support this. The body, in much early modern thought, remained porous and vulnerable. Water could still be treated with caution. Baths might be prescribed in specific circumstances, but not universally celebrated as routine. The opening of the pores was not yet a harmless image. It was a point of bodily negotiation. Too much heat, too much exposure, or badly timed bathing could still be imagined as dangerous. Physicians, household advisors, and practical manuals often approached the subject with nuance rather than enthusiasm. This did not mean washing disappeared. It meant that washing remained one practice among many, still surrounded by conditional reasoning. The social geography of water also remained uneven. Even in prestigious households, bathing infrastructure was awkward compared to modern standards. Water still had to be heated and moved. Privacy still had to be arranged. Rooms still had to be protected from cold. The body still had to be dried and redressed quickly. For many people, this made full-body bathing an occasional event rather than an unquestioned routine. It is easy to underestimate how powerful inconvenience can be in shaping social norms. When a practice requires effort, labor, and planning, society tends to reserve it for moments when that effort feels justified. This is why the eventual modern elevation of the bath and later the shower was not merely a moral awakening. It required a material revolution. It required urban infrastructure, piped water, domestic architecture, fuel systems, privacy norms, new medical theories, and eventually the industrial production of soap and fixtures. Before those systems existed widely, even people who valued cleanliness had good reason to distribute that value across easier, smaller, more flexible practices. Medieval people did this. Early modern people did it. The continuity between them is stronger than many later commentators wish to admit. And yet, alongside that continuity, something was changing. The language of civility was becoming more detailed. Courtly manuals, conduct books, and household instructions paid close attention to bodily management. How one carried oneself at table, how one used a napkin, how one handled bodily emissions, how one restrained visible appetite, how one concealed functions that had once been more public. These things increasingly mattered. Cleanliness in this world was tied to self-control. It was not only about smell or dirt. In a way, this helps explain why modern people so often misread the past. We have inherited the self-control side of that story and added modern plumbing to it. The result feels natural. We think of cleanliness as both moral and practical, both private and socially required. But in earlier centuries, those elements were assembled differently. The visible management of the body could matter more than saturation with water. Concealment could matter more than immersion. Linen could do work that modern soap and plumbing now perform. Once again, the body was being kept in order, but by a different set of tools. There is another subtle point here that deserves attention. The farther elites moved toward refinement, the less willing they often became to associate themselves with communal bodily spaces. A public bathhouse, even where it survived, could begin to feel socially ambiguous. It might serve artisans, travelers, laborers, and mixed urban populations. But those trying to mark higher status increasingly preferred controlled private settings, or substitutes that avoided communal exposure altogether. This added class pressure to the decline of certain bathing traditions. What was once civic could come to seem lower, risky, or morally compromised. The body of the elite was expected to be managed discreetly, not displayed in shared heat and water. This does not mean that all public bathing disappeared at once. In different parts of Europe, local customs lasted in stubborn ways. Some spa cultures persisted. Some regional traditions of steam and bathing survived. Some towns maintained facilities longer than others. But the broad tendency in much of Western Europe was toward a bodily regime that emphasized dry cleanliness, fresh cloth, grooming, and decorous partial washing over frequent communal immersion. By now, the medieval and early modern stories are clearly overlapping rather than separate. That overlap matters because it changes how we interpret the famous claim that medieval people rarely bathed. In one sense, yes, many of them did bathe infrequently by modern standards. But so did many people in later centuries who proudly regarded themselves as more advanced. The real historical question is not who bathed the least. It is how different societies defined bodily respectability, and what technologies or beliefs made those definitions seem reasonable. Once we ask that question, medieval people stop looking uniquely strange. They join a much longer human history of managing the body under imperfect conditions. One way to feel that continuity is to think again about the morning routines of the past. A modern person may step into a shower almost automatically. But imagine beginning the day in a world where the room is cold, the water is distant, and every act of bodily maintenance costs either effort or someone else's labor. In such a world, the basin becomes central. So does the towel. So does the clean shirt laid out carefully. So do the comb, the cloth, the mirror if one is available, the scent or herb, the attention to visible skin, the adjustment of collars and sleeves. It is a slower choreography, but it is still choreography. The body is still being prepared for society. That preparation also reveals something about time. Baths take time. Laundry takes time. Grooming takes time. And time itself is distributed unequally. The wealthy buy other people's time. The poor spend their own. This is why cleanliness has always had a class dimension. A nobleman may enjoy fresh linen and a prepared wash basin because servants organized it. A peasant woman may manage the family's bodily order by adding yet more work to an already crowded day. An apprentice may appear orderly only because someone else washed the shirt. Cleanliness is never just a personal virtue. It rests on labor systems. Medieval Europe understood this directly. Modern societies often conceal it. That concealment may be one reason the medieval world is judged so harshly. Its labor remains visible in the record. Water is carried. Fires are stoked. Cloth is beaten. Chambers are aired. Bodies are sponged. We can see the work, and because we can see it, we notice the limits. Modern life hides much of that labor behind infrastructure and technology, which makes our routines appear effortless and morally superior when they are often simply more heavily engineered. The comparison flatters us. History becomes more truthful once that flattery fades. There is also the question of smell in elite culture, which remained surprisingly important. Perfumes, scented gloves, pomanders, flowers, herbs, smoke, and carefully managed fabrics all served to create an acceptable bodily aura. These were not merely decorative luxuries. They reflected a long-standing belief that odor mattered medically, morally, and socially. To smell sweet or at least not offensive was part of appearing ordered. This emphasis on scent sits very naturally beside the lower frequency of immersive bathing. If one is trying to correct atmosphere, not just scrub skin, then fragrance becomes a serious tool. Of course, fragrance could also hide unpleasant realities. That too belongs to the story. Medieval and early modern bodily regimes were often about management rather than transformation. Smell could be softened. Dirt could be localized or concealed. Linen could protect skin from garments and absorb sweat. Hands and face could be presented cleanly even when the full body had not been soaked. From a modern point of view, this may seem incomplete. From their point of view, it was often enough to maintain dignity and social function. The goal was not to create a sterile body. It was to create a body fit to live among others. This social fitness becomes especially clear at the table. Hand washing before eating, the use of napkins, the handling of knives and bread, the control of chewing and spitting, the concealment of bodily noise. These practices all intensified over time. Table manners and cleanliness developed together. A person who managed the body well at table signaled both refinement and self-mastery. Again, we see the same pattern. Bodily order was public. It was read by others. It mattered because society watched. As this culture matured, it also changed the emotional meaning of disgust. Some bodily realities that were once more openly tolerated in communal settings increasingly moved behind doors or into silence. That shift did not happen overnight, and it did not make the body vanish. But it did make concealment more important. Bathing, because it involved exposure, sat awkwardly inside that growing preference for controlled privacy. It is not hard to see why selective washing fitted more comfortably into such a world. One could clean enough without staging a large bodily event. Still, the older fear of water as a vulnerability did not hold forever. Slowly, unevenly, and with many reversals, medical thought began to change. The relationship between skin, air, heat, circulation, and disease would be re-examined. Resorts and spas would acquire new prestige. Sea bathing would later emerge as a therapeutic and fashionable practice. Domestic architecture would adapt. Soap manufacture would expand. Public health ideas would develop. But none of that happens in a single clean leap from medieval ignorance to modern knowledge. It happens by passing through centuries in which older ideas remained alive, sometimes hidden inside newer language. And this is why the medieval story keeps reaching into the future. The reason medieval people rarely bathed, in the full modern sense, was not a single cause trapped in one age. It was a cluster of practical limits and powerful beliefs that continued to cast a shadow long after the Middle Ages were supposedly over. To understand that shadow is to understand something larger about history itself. People do not discard whole bodily worlds at once. They carry them forward in habits, cautions, customs, and preferences long after the original conditions begin to shift. So by the time regular immersion bathing began slowly to recover prestige in broader European life, it was entering a world already structured by centuries of selective washing, linen discipline, medical caution, moral self-control, and social display. That older inheritance did not disappear when baths returned. It shaped how baths were understood, who used them, when they were recommended, and what people feared or desired when they stepped into the water. And if we follow that turning point carefully, this slow moment when inherited caution begins meeting new confidence, we arrive at the next chapter of the story, where bathing stops being merely a questionable indulgence or controlled treatment and starts, little by little, becoming something closer to a sign of health, fashion, and modern domestic life. Because little by little, bathing started becoming something closer to a sign of health, fashion, and modern domestic life. That change, however, was slow enough that many people living through it would not have recognized it as a revolution. Historical transformations often feel like that from the inside. A new habit appears first as a curiosity, a treatment, a luxury, or a preference of certain circles. Then it gathers authority. Doctors begin to speak of it differently. Architects start making room for it. Manufacturers find ways to support it. Moral language shifts. What once seemed questionable becomes sensible, then desirable, then eventually ordinary. Bathing followed that pattern. And because it did, the older medieval assumptions did not vanish with a single argument. They had to be worn down by generations of new practice. In the 18th century, one of the first major changes came not through the ordinary household bath, but through therapeutic and fashionable water culture. Mineral springs, spas, and health resorts gained status in many parts of Europe. Water was still not automatically trusted as a daily cleansing medium, but it was increasingly celebrated as a controlled source of healing. This distinction matters. Water re-entered elite culture first not simply as soap and skin cleanliness, but as medicine, regimen, and managed refinement. People drank mineral water, immersed themselves in it, walked in health resorts, and spoke of the body in terms that increasingly connected bathing with vigor rather than vulnerability. This was not yet the modern bathroom, and it should not be confused with one. Spa culture remained selective, often expensive, often tied to social display. It was as much about being seen in a respectable therapeutic setting as about private daily hygiene. But even so, it helped soften older fears. Water, when carefully regulated in the right place under the authority of physicians or fashion, could be reimagined as strengthening rather than weakening. That was a very important shift because once the emotional meaning of immersion changed, other changes became easier to imagine. Sea bathing added another layer. At first, sea water was not embraced because it promised comfort. Quite the opposite. Early sea bathing in parts of Europe often carried a disciplined, even bracing quality. Cold water, fresh air, bodily hardening, and therapeutic shock became part of the appeal. Again, this is an interesting reversal. Water returned to prestige not first as warm domestic luxury, but often as robust medicine. A body exposed to the sea might be treated as a body being strengthened, corrected, and renewed. The older fear that water opened the body dangerously did not disappear, but it was increasingly challenged by the idea that the right kind of water could fortify it. Once medical opinion begins to divide or evolve, everyday culture eventually follows. Physicians were never unanimous, and old beliefs did not simply collapse under new evidence. But over time, medical writing across the 18th and 19th centuries began changing its tone. Cleanliness gained more explicit connections to health. Ventilation, fresh air, bodily regularity, and washing all started entering a broader language of prevention and public well-being. This still took many forms. Some advice emphasized cold washing. Some favored careful bathing rather than excess. Some remained suspicious of overindulgence. But the direction of movement had changed. Water was becoming less morally and medically ambiguous, at least under proper conditions. At the same time, the material world was changing around the body. Urban growth, new plumbing systems, improved water distribution in some cities, more specialized domestic spaces, and industrial production slowly made regular washing more feasible for broader populations, even if never evenly or instantly. This is where infrastructure begins to do the work that belief alone never could. One can preach bathing all day, but if water remains difficult to heat, haul, and drain, the sermon will reach only so far. Once piped water, improved stoves, boilers, and later municipal systems enter the story, the very rhythm of bodily life begins to shift. Convenience is not a small thing in history. It turns ideals into routines. Soap, too, has a larger role than it sometimes receives in simple retellings. Soap was ancient, of course, and known in the medieval world. But industrialization changed its availability, consistency, cost, and ordinary place in daily life. What was once limited, rough, or reserved for certain uses became more standardized and more accessible. That matters because habits spread most effectively when their tools become regular and predictable. A society can only be as clean as its materials allow it to be on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Once soap becomes common, reliable, and linked to ideas of respectability, the body enters a new practical regime. Yet here, again, the medieval past casts a shadow. The early modern and modern obsession with fresh linen did not disappear when bathing grew more frequent. Instead, it blended into a larger cleanliness ideal. The shirt, the undergarment, the towel, the laundering cycle, these remained crucial. In other words, the modern clean body did not replace the linen-centered body so much as absorb it. The older system survived inside the newer one. Even today, many people intuitively connect bodily freshness not only with washing the skin, but with changing clothes, bedding, towels, and fabrics. That inheritance runs very deep. The rise of specialized bathrooms also tells a revealing story. For most of history, rooms were flexible. Sleeping, storage, eating, work, and washing could overlap in ways that modern homes no longer permit. The emergence of dedicated washing spaces changed the emotional meaning of bodily care. Privacy became architectural rather than improvised. A person no longer needed to negotiate washing in a multipurpose room with uncertain warmth and passing servants. The room itself now promised seclusion, repetition, and normalcy. This is an enormous cultural shift. Once a practice has a room of its own, it gains legitimacy. It stops feeling exceptional and starts feeling built into life. That transformation also changes the body's relationship to shame. In earlier centuries, washing could be awkward partly because full bodily exposure was awkward. Limited privacy made selective washing the more manageable choice. But once private bathing becomes easier, exposure can be controlled more completely. The bath no longer threatens public ambiguity in the same way. It becomes intimate, domestic, and morally neutral, at least within the household. That alone does a great deal to normalize it. Still, the spread of modern bathing habits was uneven across class, region, and nation. Wealthy urban households often changed first. Working people might still live without reliable facilities, especially in crowded industrial cities where water access, sanitation, and housing quality lagged far behind ideals. So once again, it would be misleading to imagine a sudden universal conversion to frequent bathing. For a long time, even in supposedly modern societies, people remained closer to older patterns than later memory suggested. They washed selectively, economized on hot water, shared facilities, and relied heavily on laundering and partial washing. The triumph of the daily bath or shower as an unquestioned norm is much more recent than many people assume. This matters because it reminds us that the stereotype of the medieval body was partly created by people whose own practices were still transitional. 19th century reformers, doctors, and moralists often spoke as though they were rescuing society from a long past of ignorance. In reality, they were participating in a very new experiment, the effort to make bodily cleanliness systematic across large populations. That required not only private virtue, but public engineering. Sewers, water mains, drainage, housing reform, and school instruction all became part of the story. Cleanliness was nationalized, bureaucratized, and moralized in new ways. Once states and cities invested in it, it became easier than ever to imagine that earlier periods had simply failed to understand what now seemed obvious. Public health campaigns strengthened that illusion. As germ theory developed and the scientific understanding of disease improved, washing gained a different kind of authority than it had possessed in the medieval world. It was no longer mainly about humoral balance, odor, or moral self-command. It was increasingly about invisible pathogens, transmission, and prevention. This was a profound shift. The body was still vulnerable, but now the danger came not from opening the pores to corrupt air in the old sense, but from microscopic life, contaminated water, dirty hands, and unsanitary environments. Curiously, the emotional tone remained similar in one respect. Cleanliness still promised protection. But the logic beneath the promise had changed almost completely. That new logic also rewrote history. Once cleanliness could be defended scientifically, earlier systems of bodily care seemed not merely different but wrong. Medieval selective washing, linen discipline, and fear of hot baths no longer looked like adaptive strategies inside a particular worldview. They looked like mistakes on the road to modern truth. The old stereotype hardened further. Medieval people became characters in a morality play about ignorance and progress. This is one reason the phrase "they never bathed" proved so durable. It served modern confidence. It made the present feel rational and hard-won. And yet modernity brought its own exaggerations. The cult of cleanliness could become anxious, moralizing, and socially punitive. Bodies were judged by new standards. Poverty could be condemned not just as hardship, but as dirtiness. Entire classes and neighborhoods were medicalized and monitored. Cleanliness, like every ideal, could become a tool of hierarchy. Seen from this angle, the medieval world and the modern world are not opposites so much as different arrangements of the same human impulse. To use the body as a surface on which societies write morality, order, and fear. That continuity is worth sitting with for a moment. In the medieval village or town, a person might be judged for smelling wrong, appearing disorderly, or failing to maintain linen and visible grooming. In the modern city, a person might be judged for failing to meet newly universalized standards of bathing, laundering, or domestic sanitation. In both cases, the body becomes evidence. It says something to others. It signals discipline or neglect, wealth or poverty, belonging or exclusion. The technologies change, but the social reading of bodies remains deeply persistent. This also helps us answer a deeper version of the original question. Why did medieval people rarely bathe? Because in their world, full immersion was only one possible route to bodily order, and often not the most practical one. Why did later people bathe more? Because the material, medical, and moral environment changed enough to make immersion a more convincing, more feasible, and eventually more expected route. The difference lies not in one age caring and another not caring. It lies in what care looked like when organized by different assumptions. And if we narrow the lens back down from these broad transformations to one imagined household, perhaps a rural household at the end of the Middle Ages, or a modest urban one a century later, we can almost watch the change arrive in slow motion. The household still values clean shirts. It still washes hands before meals. It still combs hair, wipes faces, airs bedding, and fears illness. It still treats water with a degree of caution. But now, somewhere in the surrounding culture, baths are being spoken of a little differently. A spa has new prestige. A physician offers slightly altered advice. A town gains improved access to water. A wealthy neighbor installs a more permanent facility. Soap becomes easier to buy. Children grow up with slightly changed expectations. Nothing dramatic happens in a single year, But the old equilibrium begins to loosen. That loosening can be very difficult to notice from within. Grandparents and grandchildren may live under different bodily assumptions without ever naming the shift clearly. One generation calls something excessive, the next calls it healthy. One generation trusts linen first, the next trusts soap more readily. One worries about opening the body, another worries about invisible contamination. These are not just changes in habit. They are changes in how the body itself is imagined. Is it porous to air or threatened by germs? Is smell a sign of corruption or mainly of poor hygiene? Is bathing indulgent, therapeutic, normal, or necessary? Each answer builds a different world. And that is why the medieval story still feels close to us. It is not only a story about old dirt and old customs. It is a story about how bodies become meaningful within systems people rarely question while living inside them. Our own bathing habits feel natural for the same reason medieval selective washing once felt natural. We inherit routines supported by rooms, tools, advice, and social pressure. Then imagine those routines are simply what a sensible human would obviously do. History steps in and says, not quite. Sensible humans have done many different things when keeping the body in order. There is a calm sort of humility in that realization. It does not ask us to admire medieval hygiene uncritically, nor to scorn modern cleanliness. It simply asks us to notice how much of what we call common sense is really infrastructure plus belief. Medieval people did not possess our bathrooms, our boilers, our plumbing, our germ theory, our detergents, or our urban sanitation systems. We do not possess their humoral medicine, their labor rhythms, their architecture, or their intimacy with the costs of heat and water. Each world creates its own normal, and once we start seeing normal as historical rather than eternal, other questions begin to emerge. We begin to ask not only how often medieval people bathed, but how often they thought about the risks and meanings of bathing. We begin to ask how children learned bodily habits, how monasteries balanced discipline with care, how aristocratic display altered washing rituals, how urban authorities regulated smell and waste, and how changing medical theories slowly reclassified water from caution to cure to routine hygiene. The subject keeps deepening because the body sits at the center of so many systems at once. Which brings us to one of the final and perhaps most revealing reversals before the story can eventually close. The Middle Ages are often mocked for being too bodily, too earthy, too close to labor and need. But in one sense, medieval people may have understood something modern life often hides from view. That bodily care is expensive, social, and never purely individual. Water comes from somewhere. Heat comes from somewhere. Clean cloth comes from someone's work. Soap is made, bought, and distributed. Waste must go somewhere else. The body is never maintained alone. And if we follow that truth carefully, it leads us back toward the medieval household, the urban street, and the bathhouse one last time, not to repeat what we have already seen, but to understand how all these spaces together created a world in which bathing was always possible, never simple, and almost never just about getting clean. Because all these spaces together created a world in which bathing was always possible, never simple, and almost never just about getting clean. If we step back into that world one more time, but now with everything we have learned in view, the medieval household begins to look less like the opposite of hygiene and more like the workshop where a different kind of hygiene was constantly being made. It was made in routines so ordinary that later ages stopped seeing them. It was made in the early morning when water was brought to a chamber in a basin rather than piped to a room. It was made in the ordering of linens, the drying of cloth near heat, the cleaning of infants, the care of the sick, the rubbing of hands after labor, the combing of hair before prayer or supper, the inspection of skin for pests, the airing of bedding when weather allowed, and the quiet decisions about when a full bath was worth the work and when it was not. None of this was glamorous enough to become legend. But it was real, and because it was real, it tells us more about daily life than any stereotype ever could. The household also forces us to notice a basic truth that the old joke hides. Medieval cleanliness was relational. A person did not simply decide in isolation to be clean. That cleanliness depended on a chain of effort. Someone fetched water, someone heated it, someone scrubbed cloth, someone spun and sewed the garments that could later be washed, someone maintained the room, someone tended the fire, someone emptied waste, someone carried away slops, someone mended the towel or sheet after repeated use. A body appeared orderly because a household, however humble or grand, managed to impose some order around it. Once we see that, the phrase "they rarely bathed" begins to sound less like a final answer and more like the beginning of a much larger question about labor, priority, and the economics of everyday life. That economics mattered at every level. Fuel was not abstract. Wood had to be cut, gathered, purchased, stored, and guarded from damp. Water was not abstract either. Even when a well stood nearby, drawing from it was effort. In towns, queues, rights of access, or urban infrastructure could shape how water was used. In rural settings, distance and season mattered. A full bath required not only water and heat, but time. And time in a medieval household was already crowded with tasks that could not be postponed without consequence. Bread had to be baked. Animals had to be fed. Clothing had to be repaired. Fields, if there were fields, demanded attention according to the season. Children, elders, and the ill required care. In such a setting, a full bath was never just a personal preference. It had to justify itself against everything else the day required. This is why selective washing remained so sensible. It allowed the body to be managed where society most noticed it and where comfort most required it. Hands could be washed because they touched food, tools, and other people. Faces could be wiped because they were constantly seen. Feet might be washed after travel because they carried the marks of the road. Hair could be combed because disorder there was difficult to ignore. Underlinen could be changed because it touched the body constantly and absorbed what the body gave off. These acts did not pretend to transform the whole body at once. They maintained a threshold of order. And that threshold, in most medieval settings, was what cleanliness actually meant. There is something almost modern in that pragmatism, though it appears in different form. We too live by thresholds, even if our tools are different. We wash some things daily, others weekly, some seasonally, some only when required. The difference is that our infrastructure allows us to imagine our thresholds as universal and natural. Medieval people could not afford that illusion. Their thresholds were visible compromises with the world around them. That makes them easier to misunderstand, but in some ways it also makes them more honest. The bathhouse, by contrast, represented a different way of solving the same bodily problem. Instead of distributing labor across the household, it concentrated heat, water, and service in a shared institution. In theory, this could be efficient. If one heated a large bathing space for many users, one avoided every household needing to perform the whole operation separately. That is one reason bathhouses had such staying power in some regions. They answered a practical need. Yet because they concentrated more than heat and water, because they also concentrated bodies, sociability, undress, leisure, gossip, class encounter, and sometimes suspicion, they were never merely technical solutions. They were social experiments. And social experiments rarely remain neutral for long. This is one of the reasons bathhouses became such revealing indicators of broader change. When a town tolerated them comfortably, that told us something about urban custom, confidence, and the acceptable boundaries of shared life. When a town restricted them, moralized against them, or watched them anxiously, that told us something else. The history of bathing is therefore also a history of trust. How much bodily vulnerability could a society tolerate in shared space? How much mixing of classes, genders, strangers, and familiar neighbors could it absorb without discomfort? How much exposure could be reinterpreted as healthy sociability rather than temptation or danger? These are not trivial questions. They touch the deepest structures of social life, and they help explain why bathing cannot be separated from power. Authorities cared about bathhouses not because water itself was politically dangerous, but because any place where bodies gathered, relaxed, and slipped partly out of ordinary roles could become difficult to classify. A man stripped for a bath was not dressed for his trade. A woman in a bathing context might occupy a space that moralists found hard to frame. Servants, artisans, travelers, and the wealthy might come into proximity under altered conditions. Food, drink, treatment, and entertainment could blur together. From the point of view of civic order, such spaces were both useful and unstable. That instability mattered more, not less, in societies where order was carefully signaled through costume, ceremony, and moral expectation. Monasteries reveal another side of the same problem. There, bathing was neither simply forbidden nor simply encouraged. It was regulated. Regulation is often the best historical clue that something mattered. Monastic life aimed at discipline, humility, and communal order. The body had to be cared for but not indulged. Baths might be permitted for sickness, age, travel, or specific seasons, while remaining restricted in ordinary times. This is not evidence of filth as virtue. It is evidence of a system trying to balance bodily need with spiritual restraint. The monastery, like the household and the bathhouse, becomes one more site where water is filtered through values greater than comfort alone. Age mattered, too, in ways that broad stereotypes almost always miss. Children could be washed more directly because necessity overruled ambiguity. The old or infirm might receive assistance in ways healthy adults did not. The sick might be sponged or bathed under medical advice. Brides and honored guests might be prepared ceremonially. The dead, as we have seen, might be washed reverently. In other words, medieval bathing was never absent from the life cycle. It clustered around moments when the body required exceptional care, when status demanded visible preparation, or when ritual meaning intensified attention. Ordinary adult routine was selective, but the larger human passage through birth, illness, marriage, travel, and death remained deeply entangled with washing. The language of exception is important here because exceptions reveal what a society most values. A person bathed for healing because health mattered. A guest was offered washing because hospitality mattered. A corpse was cleansed because dignity mattered. A child was scrubbed because care mattered. What did not happen, at least for many, was the universalization of those exceptional forms into daily habit. That final step required a different world, one with more heat, more privacy, more infrastructure, and eventually a very different scientific understanding of disease. Medieval people did not fail to take that step because they lacked intelligence. They lived before the conditions that would make the step appear obvious. And still, even within those limits, there were moments of pleasure. This deserves to be said, because the medieval world is too often imagined as grimly practical in every bodily matter. Warmth could be pleasurable. Scent could be pleasurable. Clean linen could be pleasurable. A bath after travel or illness could be profoundly comforting. Household accounts, literary scenes, and descriptive records occasionally allow us to glimpse the sensual relief of washing in a world where such relief was hard-won. That glimpse is important because it reminds us that medieval bodies were not philosophical problems only. They were tired, cold, sweating, itching, aching, embarrassed, relieved, and comforted. Their care was felt, not merely theorized. This more human perspective also changes how we think about smell. It is easy to reduce smell to either comedy or horror when speaking about the past. But in lived experience, smell is subtle, layered, and deeply tied to emotion. Medieval people inhabited worlds of smoke, damp earth, animals, cooking, rushes, sweat, wax, leather, wool, herbs, incense, unwashed streets, fresh cloth, and changing weather. Their sensory field was broad, not merely foul. Some odors were expected, some disturbing, some reassuring, some sacred, some suspicious. To smell of smoke might simply mean one had lived indoors. To smell of herbs might suggest care. To smell sharply wrong might suggest illness or neglect. Cleanliness therefore existed partly in the management of familiar odors, not in the impossible elimination of every bodily trace. That is one reason fragrant materials mattered so much. Herbs strewn or hung, incense burned, sweet waters, pomanders, even certain laundering practices, all attempted to shape the atmosphere around the body. In a world where air itself was believed to affect health, smell was not decorative. It was diagnostic and defensive. To modern ears, this can sound naive, but in another sense, it reflects a serious attention to the body's relationship with its surroundings. Medieval people noticed what entered through breath, what lingered in cloth, what clung to rooms, and what signaled unseen danger. Their solutions differ from ours, but the underlying concern feels surprisingly familiar. If there is a deeper lesson in all this, it may be that cleanliness is never just a matter of technique. It is always moralized, aestheticized, and socialized. Medieval Europe is not unusual in this respect. What is unusual is how later centuries turned that older bodily world into an object of ridicule while ignoring how heavily their own clean ideals also rested on status, labor, and anxiety. The medieval body became a screen on which modern people projected everything they wanted to believe they had escaped. Dirt became shorthand for backwardness. Bathing became shorthand for civilization. But history rarely honors such tidy symbols. The real story, as we have seen again and again, is full of overlap. For example, consider the role of visible skin. Modern cleanliness culture often treats skin itself as the primary site of attention. Medieval culture, by contrast, often distributed attention between skin and the layers around it. The shirt mattered, the sheet mattered, the towel mattered. Head coverings, veils, caps, and undergarments all shaped how the body met the world. This does not mean skin was ignored. It means skin was treated as part of a system. In colder climates especially, where layers mattered for survival, that system made practical sense. Bodily order came from controlling contact points. Freshness flowed through fabric before it flowed through immersion. This practical system also explains why laundry was so central and so punishing. Laundry is one of the least romantic subjects in history, which is precisely why it tells the truth so well. To wash textiles in a pre-modern world was exhausting. It involved hauling water, heating it if necessary, using ash or soap, pounding or rubbing cloth, rinsing, wringing, drying, bleaching in sunlight when possible, folding, storing, and repeating the entire cycle endlessly. If a society invested that much energy in linen, then linen was not a secondary matter. It was one of the principal technologies of cleanliness. In many ways, it carried the burden that later plumbing would redistribute. And because linen carried that burden, access to it became a mark of class. The wealthy could own more garments, change them more often, and display whiteness more confidently. The poor repaired, stretched, rotated, and reused with far less margin. Here again, the body reveals inequality. A person's cleanliness did not simply reflect virtue. It reflected means. Medieval observers understood this, even if they still judged bodies morally. Later observers often pretended not to. That pretense survived into modern times, where cleanliness is still too often treated as a personal choice when it is also an infrastructural privilege. The city intensifies all of these dynamics. In a crowded town, the body is on display more constantly, but the means of controlling it are under greater pressure. Waste accumulates faster. Water is shared more heavily. Crafts and trades produce smells of their own. Tanners, butchers, dyers, smiths, brewers, bakers, all contribute to an urban sensory world that cannot be made neat by individual effort alone. Civic regulation, therefore, becomes part of cleanliness. Streets are swept or left unswept. Drains are maintained or neglected. Animals are allowed or restricted. Certain activities are pushed to the edges or kept at the center. The medieval city teaches us that hygiene was never only private. It depended on governance, even when governance was inconsistent. This is another reason the old stereotype misfires. It imagines cleanliness as something individuals either valued or ignored. But in reality, a medieval person could care deeply about order and still live in a street where others threw waste, where drainage failed, where animals moved close, and where the rhythms of production overwhelmed domestic neatness. Modern people know this too, though often reluctantly. No amount of personal washing can fully compensate for polluted infrastructure. Medieval people lived that truth every day. Their bodily strategies therefore developed in constant negotiation with environments they could only partly control. That negotiation perhaps comes into sharpest focus in winter. It is easy to speak abstractly about bathing until the weather turns cold. Then the whole subject changes. Cold affects water, rooms, textiles, and bodies. A winter bath in a drafty space risks discomfort before, during, and after the act itself. Drying becomes slower. Rewarming matters. Illness feels closer. In such a season, washing selected parts, changing linen, maintaining fires, and preserving general bodily order could feel much more reasonable than a full soak. Climate, then, is not background scenery in this history. It is one of the main actors. And once climate enters the story plainly, the idea of one single medieval bathing habit becomes even less convincing. The practices of an Italian town, an English village, a German city, a Scandinavian household, and a monastery in Burgundy could differ for reasons far beyond abstract belief. Weather, architecture, fuel supply, inherited custom, and local institutions all changed the practical meaning of washing. The Middle Ages were not one room with one temperature. They were 1,000 environments, each nudging the body toward its own patterns of care. That is why, after all this, the most trustworthy answer to the original question still resists simplicity. Medieval people often bathed less frequently than modern people do, especially in the sense of full-body immersion. But they did not therefore abandon cleanliness. They pursued it through washing, grooming, linen, scent, household labor, seasonal adaptation, social ritual, and careful attention to what their own medical and moral worlds told them the body required. The difference was never between caring and not caring. It was between systems. And as we move forward from here, that distinction becomes even more important, because the next layer of the story is not merely how medieval people lived with their system, but how later generations deliberately misunderstood it. How scholars, satirists, moralists, novelists, and filmmakers helped turn a practical bodily world into one of history's most persistent caricatures, until the image of the unwashed medieval person became so familiar that it began to feel truer than the evidence itself. Until the image of the unwashed medieval person became so familiar that it began to feel truer than the evidence itself. And perhaps that is the best place to end, because it brings us back to where we began. The question was never really whether medieval people knew what water was for. It was whether we were willing to let their world remain different from our own without turning that difference into a joke. The closer we looked, the more that old caricature fell apart. Medieval people did bathe, though not always often, not always fully, and not always for the reasons we might expect. More importantly, they washed, groomed, laundered, aired, scented, regulated, and interpreted the body through a whole structure of daily life that made sense inside their material world. They lived in colder rooms with harder labor, less privacy, more fragile infrastructure, and very different medical assumptions. They trusted linen more than we do, feared bodily vulnerability in ways that now seem strange, and often treated immersion as a meaningful act rather than a casual routine. In towns, bathhouses could serve health, sociability, and comfort, only later to draw suspicion because of disease, morality, and changing civic order. In households, cleanliness was made patiently through repetitive work that later generations barely noticed. In monasteries, courts, workshops, and village homes, the body was not ignored. It was managed with seriousness, even when the methods no longer look familiar to us. That, in the end, is what makes this subject more than a curious detail about the Middle Ages. It reveals how every society constructs its own common sense around the body. We imagine our habits to be obvious because our world has been built to support them. Medieval people imagined theirs for the same reason. Their routines grew out of fuel, fabric, weather, architecture, labor, medicine, religion, and fear. Ours grow out of plumbing, privacy, chemistry, public health, and modern expectations of comfort. Neither system is timeless. Both are historical, and maybe that is the most useful quiet lesson to take away tonight. The past is rarely as foolish as the stereotype says, and the present is rarely as natural as it feels. Once we understand that, medieval people stop being the punchline to a modern hygiene joke and become something much more interesting. They become human again. They become people trying to stay respectable, healthy, and comfortable within the limits of their own age, just as we do in ours. If any part of this story surprised you, I'd genuinely love to know what stayed with you most. Was it the importance of linen, the fear of opening the pores, the changing reputation of bathhouses, or the way later centuries distorted the medieval body to flatter themselves? And as always, feel free to leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, what time it is where you are, and what history topic you'd like to hear next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history told with calm pacing and a little more depth, consider subscribing to Boring History Documentary. And if you found this episode worthwhile, a like is a simple way to support more careful, quietly fascinating history on the channel. For now, though, we can leave the medieval world where it belongs. Not as a dark and dirty caricature, but as a complex civilization of cold mornings, worked hands, shared water, clean linen, smoky rooms, cautious medicine, and ordinary people doing the best they could with the tools and beliefs they had.